Archivist Kalen of the Lumina Prime adjusted the focal length of his ocular implant, the sea of data resolving into crystalline streams of light before him. His task, assigned by the Grand Concordance, was one of profound tedium and galactic importance, the complete codification of all Tier 3 developing species. It was a monumental work of historical preservation, a duty the Lumen had performed for millennia. They were the galaxy's memory, a civilization that had traded ambition for perspective, viewing the rise and fall of empires with the detached calm of a geologist studying strata. Ellen's specific purview was a species designated Sol 3, commonly known as humans. For months, he had sifted through their chaotic data networks, a cacophony of trivialities, political vitriol, and fleeting artistic beauty. He had charted their self-destructive history, their rapid technological leaps fueled by perpetual conflict, and their baffling cultural dualities. They were, by every Lumen metric, a standard issue aggressor species, destined to burn brightly and briefly before either exterminating themselves or being pacified by a more established power. Yet, something was deeply wrong with the data. It was a discordance, a subtle but persistent wrongness that hummed beneath the surface of their civilization. On one hand, their public sphere was a maelstrom of factionalism. Nations, corporations, and ideologies clashed with a reckless passion that bordered on suicidal. Their economies seemed dedicated to producing an endless supply of consumer comforts and distractions. But beneath this surface layer, hidden in the deep flow logistics and resource allocation manifests, a second, silent civilization was at work. Kalen traced the flow of rare earth elements, not to entertainment devices or luxury transports, but to shielded subterranean fabrication plants whose output was classified at a level that defied all civilian logic. He analyzed their demographic shifts, noting a steady, almost subliminal drain of the brightest minds from arts and humanities into theoretical physics, material science, and strategic command disciplines. The pattern was unmistakable and terrifying. Humanity was not merely preparing for war with its neighbors. The sheer scale of the mobilization, the depth of its secrecy, suggested they were preparing for a war against the concept of defeat itself. They weren't building an empire. They were building a fortress, a last redoubt. His report to the Concordance was met with polite skepticism. The term he coined, asymmetrical existential preparedness, was deemed overly speculative. They saw humanity's military buildup as a predictable, if lamentable, phase. But Kalen saw the ghost in the machine. He saw a species-wide mobilization that operated like a cancer, hidden within the healthy tissue of a thriving, chaotic society. His persistence was rewarded not with acclaim, but with an assignment meant to humble him. He was to travel to the Terran diplomatic nexus, a station known colloquially as Kepler's Stand, and verify his findings in person. The unspoken message was clear. Go see the squabbling primitives for yourself and cease these fanciful theories. Kepler's Stand hung in the void like a clenched fist. Kalen's vessel, the quiet resonance, drifted towards it, a vessel of smooth, organic curves and soft, internal light, the very antithesis of the human station. He had expected human architecture to be gaudy, ostentatious, a reflection of their chaotic nature. Instead, Kepler's Stand was a masterpiece of brutalist function. There were no soaring spires, no decorative embellishments. It was a thing of dark, composite metals in redundant, overlapping armor plates, its surface bristling with weapon emplacements that were only partially disguised as communication arrays. It was less a diplomatic outpost and more a border fortress waiting for a siege. As he was escorted through the station's corridors, the feeling of wrongness intensified. The air, though perfectly breathable, felt heavy, recycled one too many times. The lighting was stark and utilitarian. The humans he passed were a walking paradox. They smiled, offered polite greetings, and engaged in the mundane dance of station life. But their eyes were old. He saw it in the guards standing at attention, their gazes constantly scanning, their postures coiled with attention that never fully dissipated. He saw it in the engineers and technicians, whose movements were efficient, economical, and devoid of wasted energy. It was the look of a people who had been holding their breath for a very long time. His designated liaison was Ambassador Eva Rostova. She met him in an office that was as Spartan as the rest of the station, its only decoration a large, armored viewport showing the star-dusted blackness. Rostova was a woman carved from granite and patience. Her face was a map of past crises. Her gray hair was pulled back in a severe, functional knot, and her eyes, the color of a stormy sea, held a weariness so profound it seemed to possess its own gravitational field. "Archivist Kalin," she said, her voice a low, steady alto. "Welcome to Kepler's stand. We are honored by the Concordance's attention." The words were standard diplomatic protocol, but her tone was flat, stripped of pretense. It was the greeting of someone with far more important things to do. "Ambassador Rostova," Kalin replied, his own voice the calm, modulated cadence of his people. "The honor is ours. The Grand Concordance follows humanity's development with great interest." And this was the opening move in a familiar game, a dance of pleasantries and veiled intentions. But as he looked at Rostova, Kalin felt a chill. She wasn't dancing. She was waiting, a sentinel at her post, and he was merely a fleeting distraction. His days on the station became a lesson in frustration. Ambassador Rostova granted him access to a curated selection of human officials, each one a master of cheerful obfuscation. He spoke to an economist who explained their planet-spanning logistical chains as aggressive free market competition. He interviewed a cultural historian who dismissed humanity's mythic obsession with heroic last stands and unwinnable odds as foundational archetypes stemming from a violent planetary history. He met a fleet admiral who laughed off the station's immense firepower as a necessary precaution in a rough neighborhood. Each explanation was plausible on its own, but together they formed a narrative so full of holes it could not possibly be true. The humans were expert liars, not because they were malicious, but because they had been practicing for generations. The lie was now part of their culture, a truth so deeply buried it had become an instinct. Kalin retreated to his analysis, cross-referencing his observations with the data streams he could access from the station. He saw the public news feeds, filled with celebrity gossip, political scandals, and manufactured outrage, a perfect smokescreen. Then he would slice through the encryption of a deep-level cargo manifest and see the true flow of resources, trillions of tons of tungsten, yttria, and exotic metamaterials flowing not to civilian industry, but to massive, shielded shipyards hidden in the Oort clouds of a dozen systems. He analyzed their art. On the surface, it was vibrant and diverse, but in the most celebrated symphonies, the most poignant sculptures, the most enduring literature, he found a recurring theme, a profound, species-wide melancholia. It was not the sorrow of a defeated people, but the grief of a people who knew a terrible loss was coming. It was the art of remembrance, created for a future that might not exist to see it. It was the art of the condemned, polishing the bars of their cell. One night, unable to process the sheer scale of the deception, he accessed the station's unclassified historical archives, looking for the root of it all. He found countless records of humanity's internal wars, their brutality, their capacity for self-destruction. But he also found something else. He found stories of incredible resilience. He read about battles where a handful of soldiers held a pass against an army. He saw records of cities that endured sieges for years, their citizens refusing to break. He discovered a pattern of behavior that defied conventional strategic logic when faced with overwhelming odds. Humans did not surrender. They fortified. They prepared. They looked into the abyss and sharpened their spears. They were a species that had perfected the art of fighting a losing battle. The realization struck him with the force of a physical blow. This wasn't a lie. It was a racial mindset, forged in the crucible of their own violent world and now scaled up to a galactic level. They were not hiding a plan for conquest. They were hiding a war they were already fighting, or one they were certain was coming. Kalen requested one final, private meeting with Ambassador Rostova. He did not come as an archivist or a diplomat, but as a seeker of a truth that had begun to haunt his waking thoughts. They met in the same stark office, the void of space pressing in through the armored window. He did not waste time with pleasantries. He activated the holo projector in the center of the room, and his own meticulously compiled data bloomed in the air between them, a web of logistical lines, resource graphs, and probability cones. This is not the profile of an emerging empire. Ambassador, Kalen began, his voice quiet but firm. I have studied the rise of 1,000 galactic powers. Empires are arrogant. They are loud. They build monuments to their own glory and broadcast their superiority to the Seres. They expand recklessly, believing their own myth. He gestured to the glowing data. You do the opposite. You build quietly. You consolidate. You don't build monuments. You build bunkers. Your greatest engineering marvels are not public works. They are shield generators buried 3 kilometers beneath the surface of barren moons. You don't prepare for a coronation. You prepare for an execution. He looked at her, his multifaceted eyes searching for a flicker of the truth. This isn't a military buildup. It's a survival protocol. Your entire civilization is behaving like a cornered animal. My formal inquiry is over, Ambassador. Now, I am asking you, as one sentient being to another, what are you so afraid of? For a long moment, Eva Rostova said nothing. The facade of the stoic diplomat finally crumbled, not in a dramatic collapse, but in a slow, weary erosion. The tension left her shoulders, replaced by an exhaustion so profound it seemed to transcend a single lifetime. It was the weariness of a whole species. She looked at Kalen, and for the first time, he felt she was truly seeing him, not as a representative of the concordance, but as a being who had stumbled to the edge of the same cliff she had been standing on her entire life. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was stripped of all artifice, a raw nerve of truth. You, Lumen, she said softly, a ghost of a sad smile on her lips. You record history. You believe everything that has happened can be known, filed away, and understood. She rose from her chair and walked to the armored viewport, her silhouette framed against the endless night. Come with me, archivist. It's time to show you the truth. Let me show you the thing we're fighting. Let me show you the enemy that isn't just at the gates, but is the reason we built gates in the first place. I'm going to show you a file that isn't just being written. It's being erased. Ambassador Rostova led Kalen not to a briefing room or a command center, but to a section of the station he hadn't known existed. The descent required passing through 3 separate, heavily armed checkpoints, each manned by soldiers whose armor was a dull, non-reflective black, devoid of any insignia. They moved with a silent, synchronized purpose that was unnerving. The final door was not a door at all, but a seamless wall of the same dark metal that only shimmered into an iris-like aperture after Rostova submitted her palm print, a retinal scan, and a whispered passphrase in a language Kalen's universal translator couldn't identify. The room beyond was a perfect sphere, cold and utterly black. There was no discernible light source, yet he could see Rostova perfectly. The air was thin and tasted of ozone and chilled metal. In the center of the sphere floated a single, stark pedestal. Upon it rested not a data pad or a crystal, but a shard of something that looked like obsidian, yet seemed to swallow the ambient light around it. "This is a zero-point archive." Rostova's voice was a low hum in the oppressive silence. "The data within is not stored electronically or psychically. It is etched into the quantum foam, insulated from normal space-time. It has to be. Standard data storage degrades in its presence." She gestured toward the shard. "What you are about to witness is not a recording in the way your people understand it. It is a scar, a memory that refuses to heal. This is the file you asked about. Archivist. We call it the Thorn Locus, named after the man who sent it back to us." Kalen felt a prickle of unease that was alien to his placid lumen nature. This was not protocol. This was a ritual. Rostova instructed him to place his hand on the pedestal. The moment his fingers made contact, the world dissolved. He was no longer Kalen, archivist of the Lumina Prime. He was Eris Thorn, captain of the exploratory vessel Odyssey's End, and the year was 2247 by the old Terran calendar. He felt the phantom weight of a command uniform, the familiar thrum of the ship's grav plates beneath his feet. He stood on the bridge of his ship, surrounded by his crew, their faces a mixture of excitement and awe. Before them, on the main view screen, was the anomaly they had traveled for 3 years to investigate the Great Silence. It was a region of space, perfectly spherical, 2 light-years in diameter, from which no energy signature of any kind emerged. No starlight, no radiation, no quantum fluctuations. It was a hole in the universe. "Log entry," he heard himself say. His voice, Thorn's voice, filled with a scientist's curiosity. "We have arrived at the perimeter of the anomaly. All scans are negative. It's not absorbing energy, it's simply null. The laws of physics as we know them seem to fray at the edge. We're launching the first probe." The memory jumped. The probe, a small, durable drone, crossed the event horizon of the silence. For 10 seconds, its telemetry streamed back perfectly. Then, the data began to corrupt. It wasn't jamming. It was a form of conceptual decay. The probe's velocity readings became irrational numbers. Its temperature fluctuated between absolute zero and the core of a star. Its own designation, Probe Alpha, flickered, replaced by strings of nonsensical symbols. Then, the final data packet arrived. It contained only a single, repeating audio file, a sound like static, but with a horrifying, layered quality, as if it were composed of a billion whispers speaking a language of pure entropy. Then the probe and its signal ceased to exist. Not destroyed, erased. The memory lurched forward again, a slideshow of Thorn's escalating obsession and fear. Days turned into weeks. The crew grew restless. The silence was a psychological weight, an affront to reason. Thorn ordered them closer, against the advice of his senior officers. He had to understand. One night, a transmission came from the silence. It wasn't a signal in the conventional sense. It was a sequence of prime numbers, broadcast directly into the ship's quantum entanglement communicator. bypassing all conventional receivers. It was a key, an invitation. The crew saw it as a sign of intelligent life, a breakthrough. Thorn felt a cold dread settle in his bones. It felt like a lure. Against his better judgment, he ordered the Odyssey's end to cross the perimeter. The moment they entered the sphere of silence, the universe outside vanished. The stars were gone. They were floating in a perfect, featureless void. There was no sense of motion, no point of reference. The only thing that existed was their ship. For a time, there was nothing. Then, the whispers began, not over the comms, but inside their minds. It was the same static from the probe, but now it had a voice, 1,000 voices, sibilant and ancient. It spoke of endings. It spoke of unraveling. It spoke of the great and terrible relief of non-existence. Members of the crew began to break. The ship's botanist was found in the Arboretum, having systematically disassembled every plant, molecule by molecule, murmuring that patterns were a cage. The chief engineer tried to vent the reactor core, claiming the fusion reaction was too loud and too structured. Then it appeared. It wasn't a ship. It wasn't a creature. It was a presence that manifested on the view screen, in the corridors, and in their minds simultaneously. Kalen, experiencing Thorn's memory, felt his own mind fracture at the sight. It was a being of pure, weaponized paradox. It had a shape that was constantly changing, yet always the same. It was made of darkness, yet it cast a shadow. It was silent, yet its presence was a deafening roar of anti-information. It was the static given form. Thorn's memory became a frantic, desperate scramble. He saw his crewmates not die, but simply stop making sense. A security officer's face blurred, his features smoothing into a featureless mask of skin before he dissolved into a shower of gray dust. The navigator screamed as the star charts tattooed on her arm began to move, crawling off her skin and vanishing. The static was not destroying them. It was editing them out of reality. It was a sentient, cosmic force of erasure. Thorn, barricaded on the bridge, realized the truth. The static consumed information. It fed on complexity, on history, on meaning itself. A civilization was a feast. A mind was a delicacy. It was drawn to them not out of malice, but out of a hunger as fundamental as a star's need to burn. He understood why it had invited them in. It had been dormant, and their complex ship, their living minds, had been the first interesting meal to drift by in eons. His final actions were a blur of cold, desperate clarity. He knew the ship was lost. He knew they were all already ghosts, but he could still send a warning. He couldn't use the standard comms. The static would just erase the signal. He had to wound reality itself, to create a scar that even the static couldn't fully heal. He routed the entire output of the ship's warp core into the quantum entanglement communicator, targeting their home system. He wasn't sending a message. He was taking the concept of his ship, his crew, their final horrifying moments of discovery, and impressing it upon the fabric of space-time. As the overload alarms screamed and the static began to peel the very atoms from the bridge's hull, Thorn recorded his final log, a direct thought impression laced into the quantum burst. This is Captain Eris Thorn of the Odyssey's End. We were wrong. The universe is not empty. It's haunted. There is something in the dark, and its only purpose is to make the dark bigger. It doesn't want to conquer us. It wants to forget us. Don't come looking for us. Don't build monuments to us. A memory is a beacon. A history is a vulnerability. The only way to fight it is to become a weapon. The only way to survive is to build a fortress so strong so dense with meaning and purpose that it cannot be erased. For God's sake, fortify. Then, Kalen felt a final, soul-shattering sensation of being unwritten, and the vision ended. He stumbled back from the pedestal, his mind a maelstrom of another man's horror. He was Kalen again, but the calm, ordered world of the Lumen was gone, replaced by the screaming void Thorn had shown him. He looked at Rostova, whose face was etched with a sorrow so deep it seemed to hold the echoes of every human who had died in the silent war since.
"The Thorn Locust was the beginning,"
she said, her voice barely a whisper in the black room. It arrived corrupted, fragmented, more a nightmare than a message. It drove the first dozen analysts who studied it mad. But we pieced it together. We understood. We had been given a death sentence for a crime we didn't even know we were committing the crime of existing. She looked him in the eye, her gaze unflinching. That was 150 years ago, Archivist. We have not had a single day of peace since. Every ship we build, every wall we raise, every secret we keep is part of that fortification Thorn screamed for. We stopped expanding because expansion creates a larger signature, a brighter beacon. We maintain a chaotic, noisy civilian society to act as a kind of information camouflage, a smokescreen of triviality to hide the signal of our true, unified purpose. She gestured to the void beyond the station's walls. We can't tell the galaxy. We can't ask for help. How could we? Telling your concordance about the static would be like painting a target on your homeworld. Ignorance is your shield, Archivist. A shield humanity has been silently, desperately defending for over a century. We are not a cornered animal. We are the zookeepers, trying to keep a monster in its cage without telling the visitors that the bars are beginning to break. Kalen leaned against the cool wall of the sphere, the very concept of archival, of history, now feeling like a profound liability. His life's work, the preservation of knowledge, was a beacon for the ultimate predator. Humanity's brutalist architecture, their weary eyes, their hidden fortresses, it all snapped into place with sickening clarity. They weren't hiding from their neighbors. They were hiding for their neighbors. Rostova walked back to the central pedestal and placed a hand near the quantum scar. The silence Thorn found was just one nest. We've found others. They're like fungal spores in the cosmic web, dormant. But lately, she said, her voice dropping, they've started to stir. Our long-range sensors are picking up whispers, echoes of that same entropic static, but closer now. Much closer. Thorn's warning gave us a head start, but the static is a patient hunter, and it has learned our scent. The journey back to Lumina Prime was a silent, agonizing ordeal for Kalen. The sterile comfort of the quiet resonance felt like a tomb, its smooth, elegant lines a mockery of the brutal, necessary ugliness he had witnessed on Kepler's stand. The serene star charts that once filled him with a sense of cosmic order now seemed like a child's drawing, blissfully unaware of the eraser poised to wipe the slate clean. He had spent his entire existence in the service of memory, curating the grand, sprawling narrative of the galaxy. Now, he understood that history was not just a record, it was a liability, a culture, a language, a single cherished memory. Each was a morsel, a breadcrumb leading the static to its next meal. He saw the Luminan archives not as a bastion of knowledge, but as a banquet hall, its doors wide open. When he arrived, his request for an immediate, unscheduled audience with the Grand Concordance was met with consternation. Such a breach of protocol was unheard of, but something in his demeanor, a new and terrible gravity that clung to him like a shroud, compelled them to acquiesce. He stood before the council of 12 elders, his own people, their faces radiating a placid wisdom that now struck him as a form of profound, dangerous naivete. He did not present them with data charts or logistical analyses. He told them a story. He spoke of Eris Thorn and the Odyssey's end. He described the encroaching, conceptual horror of the static, the sentient void that fed on meaning. He relayed Ambassador Rostova's chilling words, "Ignorance is your shield." His testimony was met with a deep, unsettling silence. The Lumen did not panic. It was not in their nature. But for the first time in millennia, Kalen saw uncertainty flicker in the ancient eyes of the Concordance. They saw the truth of it, not in his words, but in him. The archivist who had left them was a being of calm, ordered thought. The one who returned was a man haunted by a paradox to save their history. They might have to erase it. Elder Thana, the council's most senior member, finally spoke, her voice like the whisper of ancient leaves. "This entity," she began, the word tasting strange and foreign. "It consumes information. To acknowledge it, to study it, would be to invite it. That is the human theory." "Yes," Kalen confirmed, his voice raw. "And the core of their dreadful dilemma. They fight a war that cannot be declared, against an enemy that must not be named. Their methods are extreme," another elder mused. "This silent war, this civilization-wide deception, it is an act of profound aggression, even if it is in the name of defense." "Is it?" Kalen countered, his voice rising with a passion he hadn't known he possessed. "They have borne this burden alone for 150 years. They have willingly stunted their own growth, accepted the galaxy's scorn as belligerent primitives, all to stand a silent watch over the rest of us. Is that aggression, or is it a sacrifice of a scale we cannot even comprehend?" The debate that followed was unlike any in Luminan history. It was a clash between their most fundamental principles, the drive to know versus the need to survive, the sanctity of the archive versus the horrifying possibility that the archive was a lure. In the end, it was Kalen's final, desperate plea that tipped the scales. "We cannot be human," he urged them. "Their path is one of fortresses and firepower, a grim, endless siege. It is not our way, Viti, but we can no longer afford to be Lumen in the way we once were. We cannot simply be memory. We must become the keepers of the silence. We must learn to hide." The decision, when it came, was as subtle and profound as the turning of a galaxy. The Grand Concordance initiated a new, top-secret directive, codenamed the Veil of Forgetting. It was a project of unimaginable scope and subtlety. They did not destroy their archives. Instead, they began to curate them in a new way. They started weaving threads of disinformation, of conceptual static, into their own historical records. They began a slow, careful process of encrypting their most profound cultural and scientific achievements, not with conventional codes, but with paradoxes and logical impossibilities, making the data itself unpalatable, indigestible to a being like the static. On a galactic scale, the Lumen began to withdraw. Their diplomatic overtures became less frequent. Their trading of knowledge for resources slowed to a trickle. To the rest of the galaxy, it looked like the ancient Lumen were simply entering a period of introspection, a cultural hibernation. Only Kalen and the Concordance knew the truth. They were pulling their own civilization signal from the cosmic noise. Kalen himself was given a new, terrible role. He was no longer an archivist of what was remembered, but a curator of what must be forgotten. He was tasked with identifying the brightest points of light in the galaxy, the burgeoning renaissance of the avian Tezkethi, the mathematical poetry of the crystalline Xylos, the burgeoning psychic network of the cetacean fleets, and finding ways to subtly dim them. He didn't sabotage them. He guided them. He used the Lumen's vast influence to subtly shift a promising scientific inquiry toward a dead end, to introduce a new, distracting artistic movement, to gently nudge a philosophical breakthrough into a harmless solipsistic loop. Every success was a betrayal of his deepest principles and a victory in the only war that mattered. He was saving civilizations by ensuring they never achieved their full, glorious, and fatally conspicuous potential. Meanwhile, humanity continued its grim work. Unaware of the Lumen's silent partnership, they saw only the galaxy's continued ignorance. They built their fleets, fortified their worlds, and trained their soldiers for a war they hoped would never reach their doorstep. The commander of this silent, unending mobilization was Fleet Admiral Jorek Thorn, the great-grandson of Eris Thorn himself. The Thorn Locus was not just a historical file to him. It was a family curse and a sacred duty. Eris was a man forged in the crucible of this secret war. He had known since childhood that the stars were not a frontier to be explored, but a hunting ground where his species was the prey. He was brilliant, ruthless, and possessed of a weary pragmatism that made him the perfect guardian for humanity's desperate secret. His command center was not on a planet, but deep within a hollowed-out asteroid, a mobile fortress known only as Terminus. It was from here that he monitored the whispers from the dark. For years, the static had been a distant threat, a predictable pattern of dormant nests and faint, passive signals. But now, it was changing. The whispers were growing stronger, more coherent. Worse, they were becoming strategic, small, isolated outposts in the Perseus Arm prospecting bases, listening posts. Ships on long-range patrol were winking out of existence. There were no distress calls, no wreckage, no energy signatures of a battle. They were simply there one moment and gone the next, their records seamlessly erased from nearby navigational beacons as if they had never been. It was a new tactic. The static was no longer just a passive, hungry void. It was probing. It was testing their defenses, one tiny deniable piece at a time. Jorek knew what it meant. The long, cold war of preparation was ending. The hunter was finally approaching the fire. The breaking point came with the loss of the colony on a world designated LV-426, a rugged, barely habitable planet in the outer verges. It wasn't a major population center. It housed a helium-3 refinery and a deep space research facility with a population of just over 3,000 souls. The facility's primary purpose, however, was a secret known only to Jorek and his inner circle. It was a listening post, its sensors designed not to detect energy, but its absence. It was their most advanced early warning system for static incursions. One moment, LV-426 was reporting normal operations. The next, its entire system of automated check-in signals went silent. A scout ship sent to investigate found nothing. Not a ruined colony. Not a cratered landscape. The planet was still there, orbiting its star, but it was as if no one had ever set foot on it. The refinery was gone. The research base was gone. Even the geological scars from their initial landings had vanished. It was a perfect, pristine, and terrifyingly empty world. The static had not just destroyed the colony. It had retconned it out of local space-time. But the colonists had been human, and humans, Jorek knew, were stubborn. They did not go quietly into the void, attached to the final, nanosecond-long burst of data from the listening post before it was erased was an addendum, a ghost signal designed by Thorne's own engineers. It was a single, compressed image and a looping sound file. The image was a star chart, but one of the constellations was wrong. A single star was circled. The audio was the faint, distorted sound of a human lullaby. Yorick brought the image up on the main screen of Terminus. His tactical officer was baffled. "Sir, it's a map to the Tezkethi home system. The circled star is their sun. But the audio, it makes no sense." Yorick stared at the screen, a cold, hard knot tightening in his gut. The lullaby wasn't for them. The static had learned. It had consumed the minds of 3,000 colonists and had gleaned more than just their fears. It had gleaned their knowledge of the wider galaxy. It had learned about the other lights in the darkness. The message wasn't a warning for humanity. It was a declaration of intent. It was the static pointing to its next meal. The silent war was over. The real war was about to begin. On the command deck of Terminus, the silence was absolute. The assembled officers of humanity's secret war machine stared at the ghost signal looping on the main holo display, a corrupted star chart, a circled sun, and the haunting, fragmented notes of a lullaby. They were the inheritors of Eris Thorne's curse, the third and fourth generations to stand this silent, thankless watch. They had trained their entire lives for this moment, yet the reality of it was a cold weight in their blood. Fleet Admiral Yorick Thorne stood before the display, his face a mask of cold fury. The static was not just an enemy. It was a blasphemy against existence itself, and it had just used the memories of his people as a weapon. It had consumed a human colony and, in its digital belly, found a map to new hunting grounds. The primary directive, the sacred vow of silence that had defined their civilization for a century and a half, had become a vector for the plague it was meant to contain. Every secret they kept to protect the galaxy was now a potential weapon to be turned against it. "It's using us," his intelligence chief, a gaunt woman named Kenna, whispered, voicing the thought that hung like poison in the air. "It's learned that we know about the others. It's telling us where it's going next. This isn't just an attack. It's a message." Yorick's knuckles were white where he gripped the command rail. "It's a challenge," he corrected, his voice a low growl. "It thinks we'll stand by and watch. It thinks our secrecy is more important than our conscience." He turned from the screen to face his command staff, his eyes burning with a cold, clear light. "For 150 years we have hidden. We have built our walls and sharpened our spears in the dark, all to prepare for a war we prayed would never come. That prayer has gone unanswered." He pointed a single, decisive finger at the circled star on the map. "That is Tzek, the Tezkethi homeworld. According to our latest intelligence, the static now shares they are in the midst of a cultural renaissance. Their art, their philosophy, their chorus, they are a beacon of everything the static exists to extinguish. Our silence has made them a target." The unspoken question hung in the room. What do we do? The old doctrine demanded they do nothing. To preserve the secret at all costs. To reveal themselves would be to shatter the fragile peace of the galaxy and draw the full, undivided attention of every nest of static. Yorick Thorne looked at the faces of his officers, at the legacy of sacrifice that had brought them to this precipice. "The Thorn Locust was a warning to fortify," he said, his voice ringing with grim authority. "It did not say fortify only for ourselves. The wall must now extend." He turned to his fleet marshal. "Signal Task Force Sentinel. Commander Anya Thorne is to take the fleet and proceed to the Tzek system at maximum burn. Her orders are to break the silence. She is to warn them. and if the warning is not heeded, she is to stand and fight. The silent war is over. As of this moment, we are all soldiers. The departure of Task Force Sentinel did not go unnoticed. On Lumina Prime, within the newly consecrated halls of quietude, Kalen felt the ripple of it through the galactic data flow. A human fleet of that size and composition, moving with such unconcealed haste, was not a diplomatic mission. It was an armada. He cross-referenced their trajectory with the most recent astronomical and cultural data. Their destination was Tezek. His blood ran cold. The veil of forgetting, his life's new, terrible work, was about to be torn to shreds. He had spent the last 2 years subtly muting the Tzekethi's glorious signal, gently discouraging the lines of inquiry that made them too bright, too interesting. And now the humans were arriving with a fleet of warships that screamed a challenge into the void. He brought his findings before the Grand Concordance. They are forcing the issue, Kalen explained. The calm of his Lumina nature strained to the breaking point. The humans have decided they can no longer stand their watch alone. They are going to reveal the threat to the Tzkethi. They will light a fire to ward off the predator, not understanding that the fire is what the predator sees. Elder Thana's ancient face was a mask of sorrow. Then their cure is as dangerous as the disease. A battle fought in that system will be a flare of information, of energy, of raw, structured reality. It will be a dinner bell for every dormant nest in this quadrant. We cannot stop them, Kalen stated. The truth of it, a leaden weight. But we must not stand by. The veil of forgetting was a strategy for a Cold War. The war is now hot. Our role must change with it. He looked at the assembled elders, his mentors, his guides, and saw in their eyes the same terrifying realization that had dawned on him. Their age of detached observation was over. To be the galaxy's memory was no longer enough. Now, they had to become its shield. The Tzkethi of Tezek knew nothing of the silent dread that gripped the hidden corners of the galaxy. Their world was a jewel of soaring, crystalline spires that chimed with the wind, and their civilization was defined by the Great Chorus, a shared consciousness of art, music, and emotion. They were a people of profound beauty and empathy, on the verge of a new golden age. The first sign that something was wrong was subtle, a sour note in the symphony of their world. It began as a faint dissonance in the chorus, a whisper of static that caused artists to falter, their creations imbued with an unsettling emptiness. Songs that had been sung for centuries developed jarring, meaningless passages. The sky painters, who used choreographed flocks of birds to create living art, found their creatures moving in unsettling, broken patterns. Fear, a rare and shunned emotion for the Tzkethi, began to spread like a contagion. It was a conceptual plague, an attack on their very soul. It was into this growing unease that Task Force Sentinel arrived. 12 human warships, brutal and gray, ripped their way out of hyperspace and took up a grim, orbital vigil. They were an architectural obscenity in the graceful skies of Tezek, their very presence an act of aggression. The leader of the Tzkethi, the Speaker Prime, a magnificent avian with plumage of sapphire and gold, broadcast a message of challenge. You are not welcome here, armored ones. Your silence is a threat. State your purpose or be met with the full harmony of our fleets. On the bridge of the human flagship, the indomitable Will, Commander Anya Thorn, Eris Thorn's direct descendant, a woman who wore his legacy like a coat of lead, watched the elegant, bird-like Tzkethi ships gather. They were beautiful, like shards of stained glass. They were also hopelessly outmatched. Speaker Prime. Anya's voice was flat, professional. stripped of all emotion. We are not here as enemies. We are here as a warning. There is a presence in your system, a predator. You must silence your great chorus, power down your cities. It is drawn to you. The Speaker Prime's reply was filled with indignant rage. You demand we mutilate our own soul, that we cease to be Tezkethi. This is not a warning. It is a demand for cultural suicide. We will not be silenced. Anya Thorne closed her eyes for a brief moment. She had hoped, but she had not expected. As you wish, she said, her voice now colder than the void. All ships, battle readiness. Deploy reality anchors. They will not listen. We will have to show them. The static manifested without warning. It was not a ship that appeared, but an absence. A sphere of perfect, starless black coalesced at the edge of the system, a hole in the fabric of space. The great chorus of the Tezkethi turned into a single, planet-wide scream of psychic agony as the null field expanded. Their fleet, in a display of breathtaking bravery, surged forward to meet it. They fired lances of coherent light and waves of devastating sonic energy. The static did not resist the attack. It consumed it. The beams of light dissolved. The sonic waves were unraveled into silence. The Tezkethi ships, one by one, were not destroyed. They simply faded. Their intricate patterns blurred. Their colors washed out to a uniform gray, and then they dissolved into a cloud of inert dust, their complex existence edited out of the universe. On the bridge of the indomitable will, Anya Thorne gave the order she had been born to give. Fire. The human ships did not fire energy beams. They launched salvos of immense, unguided tungsten rods, accelerating them to a significant fraction of the speed of light. They fired torpedoes that did not explode, but instead violently warped the gravitational field around them. It was a strategy of profound, brutal simplicity. They were not trying to fight the static with complex information. They were throwing rocks at it. The most advanced, fastest rocks in history. Where the Tezkethi weapons had been a gourmet meal, the human attack was a mouthful of sand. The relativistic rods, possessing almost no complexity, slammed into the null field, and for the first time, the static recoiled. The field fluctuated as the raw, kinetic energy, too simple to be easily unwritten, disrupted its integrity. The human ships advanced, their hulls glowing with a faint, shimmering light, their reality anchors. Quantum stabilizing fields that asserted their right to exist against the static's all-consuming negation. They took losses. Frigates strayed too close, and their crews' screams were cut short as their ship was simply unmade, its structure losing all coherence. But they held the line. They formed a wall of brutal, stubborn reality between the encroaching void and the terrified world of Tezek. The battle raged, a silent, desperate struggle between existence and erasure, played out in the suddenly silent skies of a world that had only ever known song. The secret was out. The first open battle of the Great War had been joined, and across the galaxy, Kalen made his decision. Hiding was no longer an option. He boarded the quiet resonance, setting a course not for the beleaguered Tezek system, but for the dark, hidden fortress he knew must be at the center of the human war effort. The veil was broken. It was time to forge an alliance. It was time for the galaxy's memory to meet its grim, unyielding protectors. His destination terminus. The battle for Tezek was a symphony of impossibilities. On the bridge of the indomitable will, Commander Anya Thorne watched the brutal mathematics of their survival unfold. For every salvo of relativistic rods they hurled into the null field, The static learned. It was beginning to anticipate the trajectories, not by calculation, but by a form of conceptual prediction. It was learning to unwrite the kinetic impactors a nanosecond before they struck, causing them to simply vanish in the void. Her fleet was a wall, but the mortar was cracking. The reality anchors, the machines that screamed their existence into the face of the void, were overheating. 2 more ships had been lost, their screams swallowed by the silence before they could even finish. They were buying time, but it was a currency they were spending far faster than the enemy. Down on the shimmering, crystalline world, the Speaker Prime watched the brutalist human ships die for a people they had never met. The initial rage and indignation had been burned away by the sheer, soul-crushing horror of the static. It had touched the great chorus, and the Tezkethi had felt the absolute bone-deep terror of non-being. They understood now the humans were not barbarians. They were martyrs, fighting a war of such profound loneliness it was a miracle they had not gone mad. The Speaker Prime looked at the remnants of its own fleet. Beautiful, useless shards floating in the uncaring dark. Their weapons of harmony and light had been less than nothing, but their harmony, their chorus, that was another matter. A decision formed, a choice so contrary to the Tezkethi way of life that it was a form of cultural death, yet the only path to survival. Sing. The Speaker Prime broadcast, not just to its people, but across the psychic medium of the chorus itself. Sing not the songs of creation, sing not of beauty or of light. Sing the song of the broken string. Sing the chord that cannot be resolved. Sing of the color that has no name. We cannot outfight the silence, but we can give it a song so mad it will choke on the notes. Sing a symphony of chaos. Anya Thorne saw it on her tactical display first. A new energy signature, but it was unlike anything she had ever seen. It was a psychic tsunami, a wave of pure, weaponized paradox emanating from the planet below. The great chorus, once a beacon of harmonious beauty, had become a shriek of weaponized insanity. It was a symphony of broken logic, a choir of contradictions, a wave of information so dense, so self-negating, so utterly without pattern or reason that it was poison to a being that fed on order. The effect on the static was immediate and catastrophic. The perfect, spherical edge of the null field wavered, convulsed, and then began to fray. The serene, patient hunger was replaced by something akin to confusion, then pain. It had been offered a feast, but the food was made of glass and razors. The whispers in the minds of the human crews, the subtle pressure of erasure at the edge of their reality anchors, suddenly ceased, replaced by the psychic shrapnel of the Tezkethi's chaotic song. "All ships!" Anya roared, seizing the moment, her voice raw with a desperate, savage hope. "Target the core fluctuation fire, everything we have left." The remaining human ships unleashed a final, coordinated barrage. The tungsten rods, the gravity torpedoes, all slammed into the now unstable heart of the null field. This time, they did not vanish. This time, they struck home. There was no explosion. There was only an implosion of profound and utter finality. The sphere of blackness collapsed in on itself, and with a final, silent shudder, it was gone. In its place, the stars shone once more, their light feeling like a benediction. The battle was won. On the surface of Tezek, the great chorus fell silent. A third of the population had been driven permanently insane by the strain. Their art, their culture, their very soul was scarred with the memory of the madness they had unleashed. They were saved, But they would never be the same. They had looked into the abyss, and to defeat it, they had been forced to sing its song back to it. When Kalen's ship, the Quiet Resonance, arrived at the coordinates for Terminus, it was met by a wall of guns. The human fortress asteroid was a testament to a century and a half of paranoia and grim determination. There were no hails, no diplomatic protocols. His ship was simply locked in a tractor beam and drawn into a cavernous, pressurized hangar bay. The being who met him was not a diplomat. Fleet Admiral Jorik Thorn stood flanked by soldiers in midnight black armor, his face looking as if it were carved from the same asteroid that housed his command. The last time a Lumen vessel took an interest in us, it was to write a report on our savagery, Jorik said, his voice flat and cold. You have come a long way to observe. Archivist, state your purpose before I grow tired of your presence. Kalen met the human's gaze, his own placid nature a stark contrast to the coiled aggression before him. I am not here to observe. Admiral, I am here to enlist. He did not wait for Jorik to respond. He projected an image from his ocular implant into the air between them. It was a map of the galaxy, but overlaid with shimmering, shifting veils of darkness. This is a map of our work for the last 2 years, since I returned from Kepler's stand. This, he said, indicating a faint shroud over a distant nebula, is a promising line of faster-than-light travel research that we subtly guided into a theoretical dead end. This, he pointed to another section, is a burgeoning philosophical movement about the sanctity of all information that we gently corrupted into a harmless solipsistic cult. We called it the Veil of Forgetting. Jorik stared at the map, his eyes narrowing as the impossible truth dawned on him. You were interfering. We were fighting, Kalen corrected softly. You build walls of steel and fire to protect the houses in the light. We have been moving through those houses, quietly drawing the curtains so the predator outside cannot see the lamps burning within. You fight a war of force. We have been fighting a war of subtlety. You have sacrificed your growth. We have sacrificed our most sacred principle, the pursuit of knowledge. We have been fighting the same war, dates, Admiral, on different fronts, in total ignorance of one another. Your silence has now been broken. Our veil has been torn. It's time to merge our doctrines. The tension in the hangar bay did not dissipate, but it changed. The raw hostility from Jorik was replaced by a slow, dawning, and deeply weary respect. He looked at this alien, this being from a civilization he had dismissed as irrelevant, and saw a reflection of his own impossible burden. He saw a fellow soldier. It was in that moment that the news from Tzek arrived, a priority burst transmission from Commander Anya Thorne. Victory. The report detailed the battle, the human losses, the static's retreat, and the terrible, brilliant sacrifice of the Tezkethi. It was the first victory against the static in recorded history, and it was a victory won not by force alone, but by a desperate, unforeseen alliance of brutal pragmatism and conceptual warfare. It was the proof of concept for everything Kalen had just proposed. An hour later, Kalen stood with Jorik on the command deck of Terminus. Before them, the star chart of the galaxy glowed, no longer a map of territories or trade routes, but a unified battle plan. The secret was out. Panic was spreading across the galactic networks, but it was being met with the first clear message of hope, a recording of the human fleet holding the line at Tzek. The Tezkethi, scarred but resolute, had become the first official allies. Their Speaker Prime's testimony a powerful call to arms for every civilization that valued its own existence. The asymmetric doctrine was born. Humanity would provide the shield, the fleets, the brutal reality anchors that could hold the line. The Lumen would provide the sword of subtlety, analyzing the static's nature, developing conceptual weapons, weaving veils of disinformation to lure, trap, and starve the enemy. Kalen was no longer a curator of what was forgotten. He was now the master of the Department of Conceptual Strategy, his life's work inverted from preservation to targeted offense. Jorek Thorn remained the fleet admiral, but he was no longer the warden of a lonely prison. He was the military commander of a galactic alliance. Soon, Anya Thorn arrived at Terminus, the hero of Tezek, her eyes holding the same ancient weariness as her great-grandfather's. But now, for the first time, tinged with a flicker of something other than dread, she stood beside Jorek and Kalen, the trinity of the new war, the soldier, the scholar, and the sentinel. The war was not over. It had just begun. The static was out there, wounded and likely enraged, its hunger now focused. But for the first time in 150 years, humanity was not alone. The lights were coming on all across the galaxy, not in ignorance, but in defiance. The long, silent watch was over. The chorus of 1,000 worlds was just beginning to find its voice, preparing for the war against the great and terrible silence.